The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Ashford Manor as Margaret Ashford carefully polished the last of the silver candlesticks in the grand dining room. At 62, she had spent the better part of her life maintaining the sprawling estate that had been in her husband's family for generations. The house felt particularly empty today, with her stepson Jonathan away on business and her husband Richard attending yet another board meeting in the city. Margaret paused in her work, her fingers unconsciously twisting the simple gold band on her ring finger. It wasn't the ring she truly wanted to wear, but that particular piece of jewelry remained locked away, hidden from prying eyes and painful memories. She had been Richard's second wife for nearly 15 years now, but the shadow of his first wife, Eleanor, still seemed to linger in every corner of the manor. The sound of gravel crunching under car tires drew Margaret's attention to the window. A sleek black sedan was making its way up the circular drive, and she could make out Jonathan's familiar silhouette behind the wheel. Her heart sank slightly. She had hoped to have a few more hours alone before his return from London. Their relationship had always been cordial but distant, marked by an underlying tension that neither of them ever openly acknowledged. Jonathan Ashford stepped out of the car, his tall frame moving with the confident stride inherited from his father. At 35, he possessed the same sharp features and piercing blue eyes that had made Richard such a formidable presence in both business and society. But unlike his father, Jonathan carried himself with a certain restlessness, as if he was constantly searching for something just beyond his reach. As he entered the house, Margaret quickly finished arranging the candlesticks and smoothed her dark hair, preparing herself for their inevitable polite exchange. Jonathan's footsteps echoed through the marble foyer, and she could hear him speaking quietly on his phone, likely conducting business even in these final hours of his journey home. "Margaret?" Jonathan nodded as he entered the dining room, pocketing his phone. "I trust everything has been quiet while I was away." "Of course," she replied, offering a measured smile. "Your father should be home within the hour. I've prepared dinner for 7 o'clock, if that suits you." Jonathan's gaze swept across the immaculate room, taking in the perfectly arranged flowers, the gleaming silver, and the way the late afternoon light caught the crystal glasses. Everything was always perfect when Margaret was in charge, a fact that both impressed and somehow irritated him. His own mother had been more spontaneous, more alive in ways that this carefully controlled environment never seemed to capture. "Actually, I may be dining out tonight," he said, loosening his tie. "I have some matters to attend to in the village." Margaret felt a flicker of relief mixed with disappointment. The fewer meals they shared in uncomfortable silence, the better. Yet she had spent considerable time planning the menu around his preferences. "Very well. I'll let Mrs. Henderson noted just the portions." As Jonathan headed toward the stairs, presumably to change out of his travel clothes, Margaret began gathering the polishing supplies. The familiar routine of maintaining the house had become her refuge over the years, a way to feel useful and needed in a family that had never quite accepted her as one of their own. She was placing the silver polish back in the storage closet when she heard Jonathan's footsteps on the floor above, moving through the hallway toward his room. The sound triggered a memory she had tried to suppress, of another evening years ago when she had heard similar footsteps, but they had been Eleanor's, pacing frantically as she and Richard argued behind closed doors. Margaret shook her head, banishing the thought. Eleanor was gone, had been gone for over 16 years now, and dwelling on the past served no purpose. She had built a life here, carved out her place in this grand but sometimes lonely house, and she was determined to protect what she had worked so hard to create. Upstairs, Jonathan stood before the window in his childhood bedroom, looking out over the sprawling grounds that would someday be his inheritance. The weight of that future responsibility had always felt both like a privilege and a burden. He loved Ashford Manor, loved the history and tradition it represented, but he also felt trapped by the expectations that came with being the sole heir to the Ashford legacy. His phone buzzed with a text message, and he glanced down to see a name that made his pulse quicken. Sarah Chen, a journalist from the London Tribune who had been investigating some irregularities in his father's business dealings. Jonathan had been carefully feeding her information for months, walking a dangerous line between loyalty to his family and his growing conviction that some of his father's recent ventures crossed ethical boundaries. The message was brief, but urgent. Need to meet tonight. Have new information about the Eleanor situation. Village pub, 9 p.m.? Jonathan's hands trembled slightly as he read the words. The Eleanor situation. For years, he had suspected that there was more to his mother's death than the official story of a tragic accident. The timing had always seemed suspicious, occurring just as she had been threatening to leave Richard and take Jonathan with her. Now, it seemed his suspicions might finally be validated. He quickly typed back his confirmation and began to change clothes, his mind racing with possibilities. If Sarah had uncovered something significant about his mother's death, it could change everything. It could finally give him the answers he had been seeking for over a decade. Downstairs, Margaret was setting the table for two when she heard Richard's car pulling into the drive. Her husband's return always brought a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. After 15 years of marriage, she still felt the need to prove herself worthy of his attention, to demonstrate that choosing her over the memory of Eleanor had been the right decision. Richard Ashford entered the house with the commanding presence that had made him successful in business and feared by his competitors. At 68, he remained an imposing figure, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his expensive suit showing no signs of the long day he had endured in corporate boardrooms. "Where's Jonathan?" he asked without preamble, handing Margaret his briefcase and coat. "He mentioned dining out this evening," she replied, hanging the coat in the hall closet. "He seemed to have business in the village." Richard's expression darkened slightly. Business in the village? What sort of business could he possibly have there? Margaret sensed the tension in her husband's voice and chose her words carefully.
"I didn't inquire. Perhaps it's social rather than professional."
"Perhaps," Richard muttered, but his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. "We'll dine without him then. I have some matters I need to discuss with you anyway." As they moved toward the dining room, Margaret felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. Richard's serious conversations often involved decisions that affected her life without any input from her, and she had learned over the years to brace herself for whatever pronouncements he might make. The dinner passed in relative quiet, punctuated only by Richard's occasional comments about his day and Margaret's careful responses. She had become expert at reading his moods, knowing when to engage and when to simply listen. Tonight, he seemed preoccupied, his mind clearly elsewhere even as they shared their meal. It wasn't until they had finished the main course and Margaret was serving dessert that Richard finally broached whatever subject had been occupying his thoughts.
"I've been thinking about the future of the estate," he began, his tone measured and businesslike. "About what will happen when I'm no longer here to oversee things." Margaret's hand paused as she set down his plate. Discussions about Richard's mortality always made her uncomfortable. Not just because she genuinely cared for him, but because they inevitably led to questions about her own security and place in the family structure. "You have many years ahead of you yet," she said diplomatically. "Perhaps," Richard replied, "but a man in my position must plan for all contingencies. Jonathan will inherit the bulk of the estate, naturally, but I want to ensure that you're properly provided for as well." Margaret felt a wave of relief mixed with gratitude. Despite the complexities of their relationship, Richard had always been fair in his treatment of her, and the knowledge that he was considering her future gave her a sense of security she hadn't realized she was lacking. "That's very thoughtful of you," she said quietly. "There is one matter, however, that requires some adjustment," Richard continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Some items that should be returned to their proper place in the family legacy." Margaret's relief began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of unease. "What sort of items?" Richard met her gaze directly, his blue eyes sharp and calculating. "Eleanor's jewelry, Margaret, particularly her engagement ring. It's time it was returned to the family vault, where it belongs." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Eleanor's engagement ring had been in her possession for years, a secret she had guarded carefully, and a connection to the woman whose shadow had dominated her marriage. The thought of giving it up felt like losing a piece of herself, even though she had never been able to wear it openly. I'm not sure I understand," she stammered, though she understood perfectly well. "I think you do," Richard said quietly. "The ring was never meant to be kept as a personal memento. It's a family heirloom, and it should be preserved for future generations. For Jonathan's future wife when the time comes." Margaret felt the walls of her carefully constructed life beginning to close in around her. The ring represented more than just jewelry to her. It was proof that she had been worth fighting for, that Richard had chosen her over the memory of his perfect first wife. To give it up felt like admitting defeat,
like acknowledging that she had never truly belonged in this house or this family. "Of course," she heard herself saying, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. "I'll retrieve it for you. Tomorrow will be sufficient," Richard said, returning his attention to his dessert, as if the matter was already settled. "There's no rush." But Margaret knew there was a rush, at least in her mind. Once Richard had made a decision, he expected it to be carried out promptly and without argument. She had learned long ago that resistance only led to more unpleasant confrontations, and she had worked too hard to build her position in this house to jeopardize it over a piece of jewelry. As they finished their meal in renewed silence, Margaret's mind raced with the implications of what Richard was asking. The ring had been her secret treasure, her tangible proof that she had succeeded in winning Richard's heart away from Eleanor's memory. Without it, she felt exposed and vulnerable in ways she hadn't experienced since the early days of their marriage. Later that evening, as Richard retired to his study to review business documents, Margaret made her way up to their bedroom. The house felt different somehow, as if the conversation at dinner had shifted something fundamental in its atmosphere. She moved through the familiar motions of her evening routine, but her thoughts remained focused on the small velvet box hidden in the back of her jewelry drawer. She had discovered the ring quite by accident, years ago, while helping Richard sort through some of Eleanor's remaining possessions. He had missed it somehow, this magnificent piece that had symbolized his first great love, and Margaret had impulsively slipped it into her pocket. She had told herself she would return it later, but later had never come. Over the years, she had taken it out occasionally, holding it up to the light, and imagining what it would have felt like to receive such a token of devotion from Richard. Eleanor's engagement ring was far more elaborate and expensive than her own simple band, a fact that had always stung despite her attempts to convince herself that the differences didn't matter. Now, faced with the prospect of giving it up, Margaret realized how much the ring had come to mean to her. It was her secret rebellion, her small victory over the woman who continued to haunt her marriage even in death. To return it felt like surrendering, like admitting that she would never measure up to Eleanor's memory in Richard's heart. As she prepared for bed, Margaret caught sight of herself in the mirror and was startled by how pale and drawn she looked. The stress of the evening's conversation had taken its toll, and she could see the exhaustion in her own eyes. She had spent so many years trying to be the perfect wife, the ideal replacement for Eleanor, and the effort was beginning to show. Outside, she could see the lights of the village twinkling in the distance, and she wondered what business had drawn Jonathan away from the house tonight. Their relationship had always been complicated, built on a foundation of mutual politeness rather than genuine affection. She sometimes suspected that he blamed her for his father's ability to move on from Eleanor's death, as if her presence in the house was somehow a betrayal of his mother's memory. Margaret turned away from the window and climbed into the large, empty bed. Richard would be downstairs for hours yet, immersed in his work as he always was when something was troubling him. She had learned not to take his absence personally, understanding that his work had always been his refuge during difficult times. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the old house settle around her, Margaret found herself thinking about Eleanor in ways she usually tried to avoid. She wondered what Richard's first wife would think of the current situation, whether she would approve of Margaret's stewardship of her home and family. The thought brought no comfort, only a deeper sense of inadequacy and loss. Tomorrow, she would have to retrieve the ring from its hiding place and hand it over to Richard. The act would mark the end of her secret rebellion and perhaps the beginning of a new phase in their marriage, one where her position felt even more precarious than before. But tonight, for just a few more hours, she could hold on to the illusion that she possessed something of Eleanor's that made her feel connected to the woman whose shoes she had tried so hard to fill. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and disappointments, but tonight, she could pretend that keeping the ring had somehow made her more worthy of the life she had fought to build. The Village Lamb pub was unusually quiet for a Thursday evening, with only a few locals nursing their pints in the dimly lit corners. Jonathan Ashford sat in a secluded booth near the back, his fingers drumming nervously against the worn wooden table as he waited for Sarah Chen to arrive. The meeting felt different this time, charged with an urgency that made his pulse race and his palms sweat despite the cool autumn air. Sarah arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and her laptop bag slung across her shoulder. At 31, she had already made a name for herself as an investigative journalist willing to tackle difficult stories that others avoided. Her reputation for thoroughness and integrity had been what initially drew Jonathan to reach out to her months ago, when his suspicions about his father's business dealings had become too heavy to bear alone. "Sorry I'm late," she said quietly, sliding into the booth across from him. Traffic from London was murder. Jonathan signaled the bartender for 2 drinks, knowing they would need the privacy that came with being paying customers. "You mentioned Eleanor in your text. What did you find?" Sarah opened her laptop and angled the screen so that only they could see it. "I've been digging deeper into your father's business activities around the time of your mother's death, and some interesting patterns have emerged." She pulled up a series of financial documents that made Jonathan's stomach tighten with recognition. These are bank records from 1990, showing some very large transfers just days before Eleanor died. Money moving between accounts, investments being liquidated, almost as if someone was preparing for a major change. "What kind of change?" Jonathan asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. "The kind that happens when someone is planning to disappear," Sarah replied grimly. "Look at this." She showed him a copy of a letter written in Eleanor's handwriting, addressed to a solicitor in Edinburgh. The content was explosive. Eleanor had been planning to leave Richard, taking Jonathan with her, and she had been gathering evidence of Richard's questionable business practices to use as leverage in the divorce proceedings. "Where did you get this?" Jonathan whispered, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the pub. Eleanor's best friend, Patricia Henley, finally agreed to talk. "She's been carrying this secret for 16 years, and it's been eating away at her. When she heard I was investigating your father, she decided it was time to come forward." Jonathan stared at the letter, his mother's familiar handwriting blurring as his eyes filled with tears. "She was going to take me with her." According to Patricia, Eleanor had discovered some serious financial irregularities in your father's companies. She had been documenting everything, building a case that could have destroyed him both financially and legally. The night she died, she was supposed to meet with Patricia to finalize their escape plan. The implications of what Sarah was telling him crashed over Jonathan like a tidal wave. His mother's death had not been the accident it had been made to appear. The car crash on the winding country road, the conveniently absent witnesses, the quick burial that had prevented a thorough investigation, it all suddenly made horrible sense. "There's more," Sarah continued, her voice gentle but relentless. "I found evidence that your father had been having the house watched, that he knew about Eleanor's plans. There are records of payments to a private investigation firm, surveillance equipment purchased just weeks before her death." Jonathan leaned back in the booth, feeling as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Everything he thought he knew about his family, his father, his own life, was crumbling around him. "What else did Patricia tell you?" She said Eleanor had hidden copies of all the incriminating documents, along with some personal items she wanted to keep safe. According to Patricia, Eleanor mentioned a hiding place in the house, somewhere your father would never think to look. "What kind of personal items?" Sarah hesitated, consulting her notes. "Jewelry, mainly. Family pieces that Eleanor wanted to ensure would be passed down to you, not absorbed into your father's estate." Patricia specifically mentioned a ring, Eleanor's engagement ring. She said Eleanor was planning to reset the stones for a daughter-in-law someday, as a way to preserve the good memories despite everything else. Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. Eleanor's engagement ring was something he had never thought about in detail, but now he realized he hadn't seen it among her possessions after her death. He had assumed it was locked away in the family vault along with the other valuable pieces. But what if it wasn't? What if it was still hidden somewhere in the house, along with the evidence that could expose his father's crimes? "I need to get back to the house," he said abruptly, starting to rise from the booth. "Jonathan, wait." Sarah grabbed his arm. "If what we suspect is true, your father is a very dangerous man. You can't just confront him with this information without having all the evidence secured first. We need to find Eleanor's hiding place and document everything before making any moves." Jonathan sat back down, recognizing the wisdom in her words even as every instinct screamed at him to act immediately. "How do we do that without arousing suspicion?" "Carefully," Sarah replied, "and with help. Patricia has agreed to meet with us tomorrow. She knows the house, visited there frequently when Eleanor was alive. She might be able to help us narrow down the possible locations." They spent another hour going over the details, planning their next steps with the careful precision that such a dangerous undertaking required. When Jonathan finally left the pub, his mind was reeling with questions and possibilities. The drive back to Ashford Manor felt surreal, as if he was returning to a stage set rather than his family home. The house was dark except for a few security lights when he pulled into the circular drive. He sat in his car for a moment, looking up at the imposing facade that had sheltered his family for generations. How many secrets did those walls contain? How many lies had been told within those rooms? Margaret was waiting for him in the entrance hall, and Jonathan was struck by how pale and strange she looked. Her usual composed demeanor seemed fragile somehow, as if she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. "Your father was looking for you earlier," she said quietly. "He seemed concerned about your business in the village. Just meeting with some old friends." Jonathan replied, studying her face for any sign that she suspected more. "Is he still awake?" "In his study. He's been there since dinner." Jonathan nodded and headed toward the stairs, but Margaret's voice stopped him. "Jonathan? Is everything all right? You seem different somehow." He turned back to look at her, this woman who had tried so hard to fill his mother's place, and felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. Whatever Richard's crimes, Margaret had likely been as much a victim as anyone else, trapped in a life built on lies and deception. "I'm fine, Margaret. Just tired from the drive." He could see that she didn't believe him, but she didn't press the issue. As he climbed the stairs to his room, Jonathan wondered how much Margaret really knew about Eleanor's death, about the secrets that haunted this house. Was she complicit in Richard's crimes, or was she another pawn in his father's elaborate game? In his room, Jonathan sat on the edge of his bed and tried to process everything Sarah had told him. The evidence she had shown him painted a picture of his father as a man capable of murder to protect his interests, a revelation that should have shocked him more than it did. Looking back, he could see the signs he had missed or ignored over the years. Richard's cold pragmatism, his willingness to destroy anyone who threatened him, his complete lack of genuine emotion when speaking about Eleanor. The sound of footsteps in the hallway drew Jonathan's attention. Through his partially open door, he could see Margaret moving quietly toward the master bedroom, her movements careful and deliberate, as if she was trying not to disturb anyone. Something about her behavior struck him as odd, more furtive than her usual quiet efficiency. Jonathan waited until he heard the bedroom door close, then crept out of his room and down the hallway. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but Sarah's words about Eleanor's hiding place had ignited a desperate curiosity. If his mother had hidden evidence somewhere in the house, he needed to find it before his father discovered what they were investigating. He started with Eleanor's old sitting room, a space that had been preserved exactly as she had left it despite Margaret's presence in the house. Richard had claimed it was too painful to change, but now Jonathan wondered if his father had kept it intact to monitor whether anyone came looking for Eleanor's secrets. The room felt frozen in time, filled with his mother's books and personal belongings that had gathered dust for 16 years. Jonathan searched methodically but quietly, checking behind picture frames, inside book covers, beneath furniture cushions. He found nothing obvious, but he wasn't sure he would recognize the clues his mother might have left behind. It was nearly midnight when he finally returned to his own room, frustrated but not discouraged. Eleanor had been a clever woman, and if she had hidden something important, she would have chosen a location that was both secure and meaningful. Tomorrow, with Patricia's help, he would search more systematically. As he prepared for bed, Jonathan caught sight of himself in the mirror and was startled by the resemblance to his father that seemed more pronounced than usual. He had Richard's bone structure and coloring, but he hoped that was where the similarities ended. The thought that he might carry his father's capacity for ruthless behavior was almost too horrible to contemplate. Down the hall, Margaret lay awake in the master bedroom, staring at the ceiling and listening to Richard's quiet breathing beside her. The conversation at dinner had shaken her more than she had let on, and the prospect of giving up Eleanor's ring felt like surrendering the last vestige of her independence. She turned to look at her husband's sleeping face, studying the features that had once seemed so handsome and commanding. After 15 years of marriage, she knew him well enough to recognize when he was keeping secrets, and his behavior tonight had been full of the subtle tension that indicated hidden agendas. Margaret slipped quietly out of bed and padded barefoot to her jewelry box. The engagement ring was hidden in a secret compartment she had installed years ago, nestled in velvet and wrapped in tissue paper. She unwrapped it carefully, holding it up to catch the moonlight streaming through the bedroom windows. The ring was truly magnificent, a large central diamond surrounded by smaller stones, set in platinum with intricate filigree work. It represented a level of devotion and commitment that Margaret had never received from Richard, despite all her efforts to be the perfect wife. Eleanor had been truly loved in ways that Margaret could only imagine. As she sat holding the ring, Margaret found herself thinking about Eleanor with a mixture of resentment and curiosity that had grown stronger over the years. What had the other woman been like? What had she possessed that had inspired such passion in Richard? And why had her marriage to him ended so tragically? Margaret had never questioned the official story of Eleanor's death. A car accident on a rainy night, a dangerous curve taken too quickly. But sometimes, in the dark hours before dawn, she wondered if there had been more to it. Richard's complete lack of genuine grief had always seemed strange, even accounting for his naturally reserved personality. Now, faced with giving up the one tangible connection she had to Eleanor's memory, Margaret felt a rebellious anger building inside her chest. Why should she surrender the ring just because Richard had decided it was time? What right did he have to take away the one thing that made her feel like she belonged in Eleanor's house? She rewrapped the ring carefully and returned it to its hiding place, but her hands were shaking as she closed the jewelry box. Tomorrow she would have to make a decision that would define the rest of her marriage and her place in the Ashford family. She could comply with Richard's demand and maintain the fragile peace they had built, or she could refuse and face the consequences of open defiance. As she climbed back into bed, Margaret caught sight of Eleanor's portrait hanging on the far wall. Richard had insisted on keeping it there despite the awkwardness it created, claiming it was part of the family's heritage. In the moonlight, Eleanor's painted eyes seemed to be watching her, judging her worthiness to occupy the space that had once been hers. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind continued to race with questions and fears. She had spent 15 years trying to prove herself worthy of Richard's love, but she was beginning to suspect that she had been fighting a battle that could never be won. Eleanor's ghost would always be stronger than her living presence, and perhaps it was time to stop pretending otherwise. The house settled around them as the night deepened, holding its secrets close and waiting for the morning to bring new revelations and confrontations. In their separate rooms, the three members of the Ashford family lay awake with their individual burdens of knowledge and guilt, none of them knowing how dramatically their carefully constructed world was about to change. Margaret woke before dawn with Eleanor's engagement ring weighing heavily on her mind. The pale gray light filtering through the bedroom curtains revealed that Richard had already risen and left for his morning run, a routine he had maintained religiously for as long as she had known him. His side of the bed was cold, suggesting he had been gone for some time. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs to start the coffee, a morning ritual that gave her a sense of purpose and control. The kitchen was her domain, one of the few spaces in Ashford Manor where she felt completely comfortable and competent. As the coffee brewed, Margaret stood at the window overlooking the gardens and watched Richard's distant figure jogging along the tree-lined path that bordered the estate. Even at 68, he maintained the disciplined physicality that had served him well in business. Margaret had always admired his dedication to fitness, but this morning his solitary figure seemed somehow ominous rather than inspiring. The conversation with Sarah Chen from the night before had left Jonathan changed in subtle ways that Margaret's observant eye had not missed, and she sensed that storms were gathering around her carefully ordered world. Jonathan appeared in the kitchen just as she was pouring her first cup of coffee, looking haggard and distracted. His usually precise appearance was disheveled, his hair uncombed and his clothes wrinkled as if he had slept in them. "You're up early," Margaret observed, offering him a cup. "Couldn't sleep," he replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Too much on my mind." Margaret studied his face, noting the tension around his eyes and the way his hands trembled slightly as he raised the cup to his lips. "Is everything all right, Jonathan? You've seemed different since you returned from London." For a moment he looked as if he might confide in her, but then his expression closed off again. "Just business concerns. Nothing that need worry you." The careful distance in his voice stung more than Margaret wanted to admit. After 15 years in this house, she was still treated as an outsider by the son she had tried so hard to win over. She had been patient with his loyalty to Eleanor's memory, understanding that accepting her would feel like a betrayal of his mother, but sometimes the persistent rejection wore her down. "Your father mentioned that he wanted to discuss some family matters with me," she said carefully, testing whether Jonathan knew about the ring. Jonathan's cup paused halfway to his lips. What sort of family matters? Heritage items. Things that should be properly preserved for future generations. She watched his face carefully as she spoke, looking for any sign of recognition or guilt. But Jonathan's expression remained neutral, though she thought she detected a sharpening of attention in his eyes. "I see," he said finally. "And what did you tell him?" "That I would consider his requests naturally." The sound of the front door opening announced Richard's return from his run. Margaret automatically began preparing his post-exercise breakfast, the routine so ingrained that she moved through the motions without conscious thought. Richard appeared in the kitchen doorway a few minutes later, his face flushed from exertion and his breathing slightly elevated. "Good morning," he said, kissing Margaret's cheek briefly before nodding to Jonathan. "You're both up early." "Couldn't sleep?" Jonathan replied, the same answer he had given Margaret. Richard's sharp eyes moved between them, clearly sensing the undercurrent of tension that Margaret felt sure was visible to anyone who cared to look. "Perhaps we should all sit down together this morning and discuss some important family business." Margaret felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. She had hoped for more time to process Richard's demand about the ring, but his tone suggested that delay was not an option. "I have some appointments in town today," Jonathan said quickly. "Perhaps this evening would be better." "I'm afraid this can't wait," Richard replied firmly. "Clear your schedule, Jonathan. This concerns you directly." The authority in Richard's voice was absolute, the tone he used when negotiation was not an option. Margaret had heard it many times over the years, though never directed at her personally. Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he nodded his acceptance. An hour later, they gathered in Richard's study, a room that had always intimidated Margaret with its dark wood paneling and walls lined with legal and business texts. Richard sat behind his massive desk while Margaret and Jonathan occupied the leather chairs facing him, positioned like defendants awaiting judgment. "I've been giving considerable thought to the future of our family legacy," Richard began without preamble, "to ensuring that important family artifacts remain where they belong and are properly cared for." Margaret's hands clasped tightly in her lap as she braced herself for what was coming. "Margaret, I believe we discussed the matter of Eleanor's engagement ring yesterday evening." Jonathan's head turned sharply toward Margaret, his eyes widening with surprise and something that might have been accusation. "Eleanor's engagement ring? A family heirloom that has unfortunately been misplaced for some years," Richard said smoothly. "I've recently realized it needs to be returned to the family vault for safekeeping." "Misplaced?" Jonathan's voice was carefully controlled, but Margaret could hear the underlying tension. "I wasn't aware it was missing." Richard's gaze remained fixed on Margaret. "It isn't missing, exactly. It simply needs to be returned to its proper place. Margaret has agreed to retrieve it for me." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret could feel Jonathan's eyes on her, could sense his mind working through the implications of what he had just learned. She had never intended for him to discover her secret this way, had hoped to maintain the privacy of her small rebellion indefinitely. "Where exactly has it been all these years?" Jonathan asked quietly. Richard's smile was thin and cold. "I think Margaret can answer that question better than I can." All eyes turned to Margaret, and she felt exposed and vulnerable under their combined scrutiny. The confession that had seemed manageable in private conversation with Richard felt impossible under Jonathan's penetrating stare. "I found it among your mother's things years ago," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "It had been overlooked when the other jewelry was cataloged. I kept it safe." "Safe?" Jonathan repeated, his tone neutral but somehow accusatory. "For 16 years. "I always intended to return it," Margaret said, though the lie tasted bitter in her mouth. "The opportunity simply never arose." Jonathan stood abruptly and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that reminded Margaret painfully of Richard. The resemblance between father and son had never been more apparent than in this moment of controlled anger. "I'd like to see it," Jonathan said without turning around. "Of course," Richard replied smoothly. "Margaret will retrieve it now, won't you, my dear?" The endearment felt like mockery, and Margaret realized that Richard was enjoying her discomfort far more than was necessary. This public humiliation was not required for the simple return of a piece of jewelry. It was designed to put her firmly in her place and remind her of her position in the family hierarchy. "I'll get it now." she said, rising on unsteady legs. "We'll wait here," Richard said pleasantly. Margaret made her way upstairs on trembling legs, her mind racing with the implications of what had just occurred. Jonathan's reaction had been more controlled than she had expected, but she could sense the fury burning beneath his composed exterior. Whatever fragile relationship they had built over the years felt damaged, perhaps irreparably. In her bedroom, Margaret opened the jewelry box and retrieved the hidden ring one last time. The diamonds caught the morning light streaming through the windows, sending small rainbows dancing across the walls. For just a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would have felt like to receive such a token of love from Richard, to be valued and cherished the way Eleanor had been. The fantasy was interrupted by the sound of voices from the study below. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone suggested an intense conversation between Richard and Jonathan. Were they discussing her behavior? Planning additional punishments for her presumption? The uncertainty made her feel sick with anxiety. Margaret wrapped the ring in tissue paper one final time and made her way back downstairs. The study had fallen silent by the time she reached the doorway, and both men turned to look at her with expressions she couldn't quite read. "Here," she said simply, placing the wrapped ring on Richard's desk. Richard unwrapped it carefully, holding it up to the light to examine the stones. "Magnificent craftsmanship," he commented. "It belonged to my grandmother originally, before I had it reset for Eleanor. A true family treasure." Jonathan stepped closer to look at the ring, and Margaret saw his face change as he recognized it. "I remember this," he said softly. "She wore it every day until the end." "Indeed," Richard replied, rewrapping the ring and placing it in his desk drawer. "It will be properly preserved now for the next generation of Ashford wives." The casual dismissal of Margaret's 16-year guardianship of the ring stung, but she forced herself to remain silent. She had lost this battle before it had even begun, and any protest would only make her position more precarious. "If there's nothing else," she said quietly, "I have household matters to attend to." "Actually, there is something else," Richard said, his tone suggesting this had been planned all along. "I think it would be beneficial for Jonathan to take a more active role in managing the family assets, starting with a complete inventory of all valuable items in the house." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. A complete inventory would reveal any other secrets she might be harboring, any other small acts of defiance or preservation that she had committed over the years. The thought of having every corner of her private world examined and catalogued felt like a violation too terrible to contemplate. "That's an excellent idea," Jonathan said, though his tone was difficult to read. "When should we begin?" "This afternoon," Richard replied. "No time like the present." Margaret excused herself as quickly as possible, fleeing to the kitchen where she could think and regroup. The morning had been a disaster, exposing her secret and positioning her as an untrustworthy guardian of family property. But something in Jonathan's reaction troubled her beyond the obvious disappointment and anger. There had been something else in his expression when he looked at the ring, a recognition that went beyond simple memory. He had seemed almost calculating, as if he was processing information that went beyond the simple question of jewelry ownership. Margaret busied herself with unnecessary kitchen tasks, trying to process the changed dynamics of her household. The careful balance she had maintained for 15 years felt disrupted, possibly permanently. Richard's public humiliation of her had shifted something fundamental in their relationship, and she wasn't sure how to recover her footing. The sound of the front door closing drew her attention to the window. Jonathan was walking quickly toward his car, his phone pressed to his ear. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his posture, the urgent quality of his movement that suggested important business requiring immediate attention. Within minutes, he was driving away from Ashford Manor, leaving Margaret alone with Richard and the knowledge that her position in the family had been irrevocably altered. Whatever conversation had taken place between father and son after her departure, it had resulted in Jonathan's rapid departure and her continued uncertainty about the future. Richard appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking more satisfied than Margaret had seen him in weeks. "Well, that's settled," he said pleasantly. "Now we can move forward with proper family management." Margaret nodded mutely, not trusting herself to speak without revealing the depth of her anger and hurt. She had spent 15 years building a life in this house, only to have it undermined in a single morning by the revelation of one secret. The injustice of it burned in her chest, but she was powerless to protest without risking even greater consequences. As Richard returned to his study to make business calls, Margaret found herself wondering what other secrets this house contained, what other revelations might be waiting to destroy the careful stability she had worked so hard to create. The ring had been just the beginning. She was certain of it, and the look in Jonathan's eyes when he had seen it suggested that much larger storms were approaching. Outside, the autumn wind was picking up, rattling the windows and sending dead leaves skittering across the manor's manicured grounds. Margaret watched the chaotic dance of the foliage and felt a kinship with its helplessness, its inability to control the forces that tossed it about without regard for its preferences or destination. The ring was gone, her secret exposed, and her position in the family more precarious than ever. But Margaret Ashford was not ready to surrender without a fight. If Richard wanted to play games of power and humiliation, she would need to learn the rules quickly and find her own ways to level the playing field. The afternoon inventory loomed ahead of her like a threat, but it also presented opportunities. If Jonathan was planning to search the house thoroughly, she needed to ensure that any other secrets remained hidden. And if Eleanor had indeed left behind evidence of Richard's wrongdoing, as she was beginning to suspect might be the case, Margaret needed to find it first. The game had changed, but it was far from over. Jonathan met Sarah Chen and Patricia Hemley at a small cafe in the neighboring village of Millbrook, far enough from Ashford Manor to avoid unwanted attention, but close enough for a quick return if needed. Patricia was a slight woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes that held decades of carefully guarded secrets. The weight of those secrets was evident in her nervous gestures and the way she continuously glanced around the cafe as if expecting to be overheard. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us," Jonathan said quietly as they settled into a corner booth away from other customers. Patricia wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and looked directly at him for the first time. "You have Eleanor's eyes," she said softly. "She would be so proud of the man you've become." The comment brought unexpected tears to Jonathan's eyes. He had so few memories of his mother's friends, most of them having drifted away after her death, or been deliberately excluded by his father. Patricia represented a connection to Eleanor that he had thought was lost forever. "Sarah mentioned that you had information about my mother's final weeks," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. Patricia nodded grimly. "Eleanor was terrified during those last months. She had discovered some terrible things about your father's business dealings, and she knew he was watching her. She was planning to leave him and take you with her, but she needed evidence to ensure he couldn't prevent it legally." "What kind of evidence?" Jonathan asked. "Financial documents, mainly. Bank records, correspondence with business partners, proof of illegal activities that could have destroyed him." Eleanor was meticulous. She photographed everything and kept copies hidden away. Sarah leaned forward intently. "Do you know where she hid them?" "She never told me the exact location, but she mentioned it was somewhere in the house that held special meaning for both of you," Patricia said, looking at Jonathan. "Somewhere your father wouldn't think to look because it was part of your childhood together." Jonathan's mind raced through possibilities. He and Eleanor had shared many special places in the large house and sprawling grounds. His childhood bedroom, the library where she had read to him, the conservatory where they had planted seeds together. Any of these could have been Eleanor's chosen hiding place. "There's something else," Patricia continued, her voice dropping even lower. "Eleanor suspected that Richard was having her followed. The day before she died, she called me in a panic. She said someone had been in the house while she was out, that things had been moved subtly but enough for her to notice." Jonathan felt ice forming in his stomach. She thought he knew about her plans? She was certain of it. That's why she was so desperate to finalize everything quickly. "We were supposed to meet the night she died to go over the final details of her escape." Sarah consulted her notes. "The police report says Eleanor died around 9 p.m. in a single-car accident on Birchwood Lane. What time were you supposed to meet?"
8:30, Patricia replied, her voice breaking slightly.
"When she didn't show up, I called the house." Richard answered and said she had gone out for a drive to clear her head after an argument. He seemed so calm, so matter-of-fact. It wasn't until the next morning that I learned about the accident. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with horrible clarity. Eleanor had been murdered to prevent her escape, and Richard had carefully orchestrated it to look like a tragic accident. The realization made Jonathan feel sick with rage and grief, but it also strengthened his resolve to find the evidence his mother had died trying to protect.
I need to search the house, he said firmly. If the documents are still there, I have to find them. Be careful, Patricia warned. If Richard killed once to protect his secrets, he won't hesitate to do it again. You're his son, but you're also the biggest threat to his legacy if you expose him. Jonathan nodded grimly, understanding the danger but unable to back down now that he was so close to the truth. Can you help me narrow down the possible locations? Think about the places Eleanor mentioned, the rooms or areas that were special to our relationship. Patricia closed her eyes and concentrated. She talked about your bedtime stories often, how you would beg her to read just one more chapter. And she mentioned the garden quite frequently, something about planting hope for the future. The conservatory, Jonathan said immediately. We spent hours there together planting seeds and watching them grow. She used to say that gardens were about faith in tomorrow. That sounds right. Patricia agreed. Eleanor believed in symbols, in the power of meaningful places. If she was going to hide something precious, she would choose a location that held emotional significance. They spent another hour going over details, with Patricia sharing memories of Eleanor that painted a picture of a woman far more complex and courageous than the idealized figure Jonathan had carried in his childhood memories. Eleanor had been planning an elaborate escape that would have exposed Richard's crimes and protected her son, a plan that had cost her life when Richard discovered it. As they prepared to leave, Patricia grasped Jonathan's hand tightly. Eleanor loved you more than life itself, she said earnestly. Everything she did was to protect your future. Don't let her sacrifice be in vain. Jonathan drove back to Ashford Manor with his emotions in turmoil. The knowledge that his mother had died trying to save him from Richard's influence filled him with a complex mixture of grief and determination. He could no longer pretend that his father was simply a demanding businessman with questionable ethics. Richard Ashford was a murderer, and Jonathan was living in the same house with his mother's killer. The manor seemed different when he returned, more sinister somehow now that he understood its dark history. Margaret was in the garden when he pulled into the drive, tending to the late-season flowers with her usual meticulous care. She looked up as he approached, and he could see the strain of the morning's confrontation written in the lines around her eyes. "How are you holding up?" he asked, surprising himself with the genuine concern in his voice. Margaret straightened slowly, brushing dirt from her gardening gloves. "I've been better," she admitted. "Your father is displeased with my handling of family property." Jonathan studied her face, noting the exhaustion and defeat that she was trying to hide. For the first time, he found himself wondering what life had been like for Margaret all these years, living in Eleanor's shadow and trying to earn acceptance from a family that might never truly embrace her. "The ring?" he said carefully. "How long have you had it?" Margaret's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I found it not long after your father and I married. It was mixed in with some books Eleanor had left behind, overlooked when her jewelry was catalogued. I should have returned it immediately." "But you didn't." "No," Margaret admitted. "I kept it. It made me feel connected to her somehow. Connected to the woman whose place I was trying to fill." Jonathan felt an unexpected wave of sympathy for his stepmother. He had spent years resenting her presence in the house, seeing her as an intruder who was trying to replace his mother. But now he realized that Margaret had been struggling with Eleanor's ghost just as much as he had, perhaps more so. "She was a remarkable woman," he said gently. "So I've always heard," Margaret replied with a bitter smile. "It's difficult to compete with perfection, especially when that perfection is preserved in death." The comment revealed more vulnerability than Margaret usually allowed herself to show, and Jonathan found himself seeing her in a new light. She had been the enemy in his mind for so long, but perhaps she was just another victim of Richard's manipulations. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" Jonathan said, making a decision that surprised him. "Of course. Do you know anything about the circumstances of my mother's death, beyond the official story?" Margaret's face went very pale, and she glanced nervously toward the house. "What do you mean?" "I mean, did anything about it ever seem unusual to you? The timing, my father's reaction, anything at all?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with whether to share whatever thoughts had been troubling her. "Your father never grieved," she said finally. "Not in any way that seemed genuine. He was sad that you were hurt by the loss, but he never seemed to miss Eleanor herself. It was as if he was relieved. The admission hung in the air between them,
dangerous and significant. Jonathan realized that Margaret had been harboring her own doubts about Richard for years, just as he had. "There's going to be an inventory this afternoon," he said quietly. "My father wants me to catalog all the valuable items in the house." Margaret nodded. "He mentioned that. I assume it's meant to ensure that no other family treasures go missing." "Probably," Jonathan agreed. "But it also gives us an opportunity to search thoroughly. If there are other secrets in this house, we might be able to find them." The word "us" seemed to surprise Margaret as much as it surprised Jonathan. He hadn't planned to include her in his investigation, but something about her vulnerability and her own suspicions about Richard made him reconsider. She knew the house better than anyone, and she had her own reasons for wanting to understand the truth about Eleanor. "What kind of secrets?" Margaret asked carefully. Jonathan made another decision that felt both dangerous and necessary. "I think my mother was murdered, Margaret, and I think my father was responsible." Margaret's hand flew to her throat, her eyes widening with shock and fear. "Jonathan, you can't say things like that. If Richard heard you, he won't hear me." "But I need to find proof, and I need help. The question is whether you're willing to provide it." Margaret stared at him for a long moment, and Jonathan could see her weighing the risks against her own doubts and fears. Finally, she nodded, slowly. "What do you need me to do?" They spent the next hour developing a plan. While Jonathan conducted the official inventory, Margaret would search the areas that held special significance for Eleanor and Jonathan's relationship. The conservatory was their primary target, but they also identified several other possibilities: Eleanor's sitting room, the library, and the attic storage areas where childhood mementos were kept.
"We have to be careful," Jonathan warned.
"If my father suspects what we're really doing, I understand the risks," Margaret replied. "But I've spent 15 years wondering why I could never measure up to Eleanor's memory. If she was murdered, then maybe it wasn't about her perfection at all. Maybe it was about her courage." When Richard returned from his afternoon meetings, he found Jonathan and Margaret in the library, surrounded by carefully organized stacks of books and papers. The official inventory was proceeding methodically, with Jonathan documenting each valuable item, while Margaret assisted with the cataloging. "How is the progress?" Richard asked, his tone suggesting satisfaction with their industry. "Quite well," Jonathan replied without looking up from his ledger. "We should have the main floor completed by evening." "Excellent. I want a comprehensive record of everything of value. No more surprises like this morning's discovery." As Richard left to return to his study, Margaret caught Jonathan's eye and nodded slightly toward the conservatory. They had agreed that she would search there while he kept Richard occupied with the inventory process. The afternoon was running out, and they both felt the urgency of finding Eleanor's hidden evidence before anyone else discovered it. Margaret made her way to the conservatory as casually as possible, carrying a watering can to provide cover for her presence there. The room was filled with afternoon sunlight streaming through the glass walls, illuminating the carefully tended plants that she had maintained for years without knowing their true significance. She began searching systematically, looking for any signs of disturbance or unusual hiding places. Eleanor had been clever and desperate, which meant the hiding place would be both secure and meaningful. Margaret examined the large planters, the gardening tools, the decorative elements that had remained unchanged since Eleanor's time. It was behind a large ceramic planter containing a mature olive tree that Margaret's fingers found the loose stone in the foundation wall. The stone moved when she pressed it, revealing a small cavity that had been carefully sealed with waterproof material. Her heart pounded as she worked the package free, recognizing that she was holding something that Eleanor had died to protect. The package was smaller than she had expected, wrapped in oiled cloth and sealed with tape that had somehow survived 16 years in its hiding place. Margaret's hands trembled as she rewrapped it and concealed it in her gardening supplies, knowing that she was now carrying evidence that could destroy Richard and possibly endanger both her and Jonathan's lives. She returned to the library with studied casualness, continuing her assistance with the inventory while waiting for an opportunity to share her discovery with Jonathan. The package felt like it was burning through her gardening basket, and every moment that passed increased the risk of discovery. It wasn't until evening, after Richard had retired to his study for his usual post-dinner business calls, that Margaret was able to signal Jonathan to meet her in the conservatory. The room was dark except for the security lighting from the grounds, creating an atmosphere of secrecy and danger that seemed appropriate for what they were about to discover. "I found something," Margaret whispered, producing the wrapped package with shaking hands. Jonathan took it reverently, understanding that he was about to learn secrets that his mother had died to protect. As he carefully unwrapped the oiled cloth, both he and Margaret held their breath, knowing that their lives were about to change forever. Inside the waterproof wrapping were documents, photographs, and a single piece of jewelry that made both of them gasp with recognition. Eleanor's real engagement ring lay nestled among the papers, the one she had worn for years before Richard had secretly replaced it with a replica. The documents were exactly what Sarah Chen and Patricia Henley had described: bank records, correspondence, and photographic evidence of Richard's illegal activities. But there was something else, something that made Jonathan's blood run cold as he read it by the dim light filtering through the conservatory windows. A letter addressed to him, written in Eleanor's handwriting and dated just 2 days before her death. A letter that proved beyond any doubt that Richard Ashford was a murderer and that Jonathan's mother had known exactly what was going to happen to her. Jonathan's hands trembled as he read his mother's final letter, her familiar handwriting blurring through his tears. The words were searing in their clarity and devastating in their implications. "My dearest Jonathan, if you are reading this, then my worst fears have come to pass. Your father has discovered my plans to leave him, and I did not survive his response. I want you to know that everything I did was to protect you from the man he truly is. The documents I have gathered will prove his crimes, but more importantly, they will give you the power to choose your own destiny, free from his influence. I love you more than words can express, and I pray that someday justice will prevail. Your loving mother, Eleanor." Margaret read over his shoulder, her sharp intake of breath echoing in the quiet conservatory. "Dear God," she whispered. She knew what he was going to do to her. Jonathan carefully refolded the letter and began examining the other documents. Bank records showed systematic money laundering through shell companies. Correspondence revealed bribes to government officials. Photographs documented meetings with known criminals. Eleanor had assembled a comprehensive case against Richard that would have destroyed him completely if she had lived to use it. "We have to take this to the authorities," Margaret said, though her voice shook with fear. "No," Jonathan replied quietly. "Not yet. This evidence has been hidden for 16 years. If we move too quickly now, my father might destroy us both before we can get it to safety." Margaret stared at him, recognizing something cold and calculating in his expression that reminded her uncomfortably of Richard. "What are you planning?" Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, his mind working through possibilities and consequences. "My father murdered my mother to protect his secrets. He's lived freely for 16 years while her body rotted in the ground. I think he deserves to know what it feels like to be hunted." "Jonathan, you're talking about revenge, not justice." "I'm talking about both," he replied firmly. "But first, I need to ensure this evidence is preserved. If something happens to us, I want to make sure Richard doesn't escape consequences." They spent the next hour photographing every document and uploading the images to a secure cloud storage account. Jonathan also prepared sealed copies to be delivered to Sarah Chen and several other journalists, with instructions to publish everything if he or Margaret failed to check in regularly. As they worked, Margaret found herself studying Jonathan's face in the dim light. The revelation about Eleanor's murder had transformed him in ways that both impressed and frightened her. The uncertainty and emotional vulnerability she had observed over the years had been replaced by a cold determination that was eerily reminiscent of his father. "What happens next?" she asked when they had finished securing the evidence. "Now we wait," Jonathan replied, "and we watch. My father thinks he's safe, thinks his secrets died with my mother. I want him to feel that security slipping away slowly." "And what about me?" Margaret asked quietly. "Where do I fit in this plan for justice?" Jonathan looked at her with something approaching respect. "You have a choice, Margaret. You can pretend this never happened and hope my father never discovers your involvement. Or you can help me make sure he pays for what he did." Margaret thought about the 15 years she had spent trying to win Richard's love, competing with the ghost of a woman she now knew had been murdered. The revelation changed everything about her understanding of their marriage and her place in the Ashford family. "What would you need me to do?" "Keep acting normal. Don't let him suspect that anything has changed. But watch him carefully and report anything unusual. If he starts to suspect we know the truth, we'll need advance warning." They returned to the house separately, maintaining the pretense that nothing significant had occurred. Margaret went through her evening routine mechanically, her mind reeling with the implications of what they had discovered. When Richard emerged from his study an hour later, she had to fight to keep her expression neutral as she looked at the man who had murdered his first wife. "How did the inventory progress this afternoon?" Richard asked pleasantly as he poured himself a brandy. "Quite well," Margaret replied, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "Jonathan was very thorough. I think you'll be pleased with the results." Richard smiled with satisfaction. "I'm sure I will. It's important to know exactly what we have and where it belongs. No more unpleasant surprises." The casual arrogance in his tone made Margaret's stomach turn, but she forced herself to nod agreeably. "Of course. Proper stewardship of family assets." "Precisely," Richard said, raising his glass in a mock toast. "To family legacy." Margaret managed to touch her wine glass to his without revealing the revulsion she felt. She excused herself soon after, claiming exhaustion from the day's activities. In the privacy of her bedroom, she finally allowed herself to process the full horror of what she had learned. Eleanor had not been the perfect woman that Margaret had spent years feeling inadequate to replace. She had been a victim, murdered by the man Margaret had married. The competition Margaret had imagined between them had been entirely one-sided, a product of Richard's manipulation and her own insecurities. Downstairs, Jonathan sat in the library staring at a book he wasn't reading, his mind focused entirely on planning his next moves. The evidence they had found would certainly convict Richard of multiple crimes, including Eleanor's murder. But Jonathan wanted more than legal justice. He wanted his father to experience the fear and helplessness that Eleanor had felt in her final weeks. The sound of footsteps on the stairs told him that Margaret and Richard were retiring for the evening. Soon the house would be quiet, and Jonathan could begin the psychological warfare he had been planning. Richard Ashford had destroyed his mother's life with calculation and cruelty. Now it was time for him to discover what it felt like to be on the receiving end of such treatment. Over the following days, Jonathan began his campaign with subtle precision. He started leaving Eleanor's favorite flowers on her grave, knowing that Richard occasionally visited the cemetery and would notice the fresh tributes. He arranged for copies of Eleanor's favorite books to be delivered to Richard's office with no return address. He had her engagement ring photographed and sent the image anonymously to Richard's business associates. Each gesture was small and seemingly innocent, but collectively they created an atmosphere of mounting unease. Richard began to show signs of stress that Margaret, now watching him carefully, was quick to notice and report to Jonathan. "He's not sleeping well," she told Jonathan during one of their careful conversations. "He wakes up several times each night and checks the locks on all the doors. Yesterday, I caught him going through Eleanor's old papers, looking for something specific." "Good," Jonathan replied with cold satisfaction. "Let him wonder what ghosts are stirring." Margaret was disturbed by the transformation in Jonathan's personality. The revenge he was orchestrating was methodical and cruel, designed to slowly drive Richard to a breaking point. While she understood his anger and shared his desire for justice, she worried about what this campaign was doing to Jonathan's own soul. "Don't become him," she warned during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "Don't let the desire for revenge turn you into the same kind of monster." "I'm nothing like him," Jonathan replied sharply. "Aren't you?" Margaret challenged. "You're manipulating someone psychologically, playing with their fears, trying to control their reality." "How is that different from what he did to Eleanor?" The question stopped Jonathan cold, forcing him to examine his own motivations and methods. For a moment, Margaret saw uncertainty flicker in his eyes, a recognition that his pursuit of justice might be corrupting him in ways he hadn't considered. "The difference," he said finally, "is that Richard is getting what he deserves. Eleanor was innocent." "And what about when this is over?" Margaret pressed. "What happens to you then? Will you be able to stop being cruel and calculating, or will those qualities become permanent parts of who you are?" Jonathan didn't answer, but Margaret could see that her words had affected him. The realization that revenge might exact its own price on the avenger was not something he had fully considered. As the psychological pressure on Richard intensified, his behavior became increasingly erratic. He hired additional security for the house, claiming he was concerned about recent break-ins in the area. He began asking Margaret detailed questions about her daily activities and any visitors or phone calls she might have received. Most tellingly, he started making inquiries about Eleanor's former friends, particularly Patricia Henley. "He's getting suspicious," Margaret warned Jonathan. "Yesterday, he asked me if I had ever met any of Eleanor's old friends. He seemed particularly interested in whether anyone had contacted me recently." Jonathan realized that their investigation was approaching a critical point. If Richard discovered that Patricia had talked to them, he might take drastic action to protect himself. They needed to move quickly to ensure the evidence reached the proper authorities before Richard could silence them. That evening, Jonathan called Sarah Chen and arranged an emergency meeting. They would transfer all of Eleanor's documents to her that night, ensuring that the evidence would be safe regardless of what happened to them. Sarah had already been investigating Richard's business dealings independently, and Eleanor's evidence would provide the final pieces needed to build an airtight case. As Jonathan prepared for what he sensed might be their final confrontation with Richard, he reflected on Margaret's warning about the corrupting nature of revenge. She had been right to be concerned. The pursuit of justice for his mother had awakened something dark and ruthless in his personality, qualities that felt disturbingly familiar. But it was too late to change course now. Richard Ashford had murdered Eleanor to protect his secrets, and he would murder again if he felt threatened. The only way to ensure justice was to make sure Richard never had another opportunity to hurt innocent people. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Richard announced at breakfast that he would be traveling to London for several days on urgent business matters. The timing seemed suspicious, particularly given his increasingly paranoid behavior over the past weeks. "Perhaps I should accompany you," Margaret suggested carefully. "I could do some shopping while you attend to your meetings." "No," Richard replied firmly. "This trip requires my complete focus. You'll be more comfortable here." After Richard left for London, Jonathan and Margaret conducted a thorough search of his study. Hidden in a concealed safe behind a false panel, they found documents that revealed the true scope of Richard's criminal activities. Financial records showed systematic tax evasion, money laundering, and fraud spanning decades. Most damning of all was a detailed plan for eliminating potential threats to his operation, a plan that included contingencies for dealing with family members who became liabilities. "He's planning to kill us," Margaret whispered as she read through Richard's notes. "We're on his list of potential threats to be eliminated." Jonathan felt ice forming in his veins as he realized how much danger they were in. Richard's trip to London wasn't business. It was preparation for murder. He was likely arranging for their deaths to look like accidents, just as he had with Eleanor 16 years earlier. They had run out of time for subtle revenge. Now it was simply a matter of survival, and they had less than a week to ensure that Richard Ashford faced justice before he could complete his deadly plans. The final confrontation was coming, and Jonathan knew that only one of them would survive it. The question was whether he could stop his father without becoming the same kind of monster that Richard had always been. Eleanor's legacy hung in the balance, along with their lives and the future of everyone Richard might target next. The game that had begun with a hidden ring was about to reach its explosive conclusion, and neither Jonathan nor Margaret was entirely certain they were prepared for what Richard would do when he realized his secrets had been exposed. But they had no choice except to see it through to whatever end awaited them all.